So you want to know the difference between competing at white belt and blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There are quite a few differences. The rule sets are a little bit different. In some no-gi blue belt competitions, you're allowed to do heel hooks. Most of the time, rule sets are generally the same. The difference comes down to two main factors: the size of the divisions and the level of competitor. Usually white belt tournaments are very large. White belts have the largest pool of competition, but sometimes they can be less competitive. Blue belts are still very large because there are a lot of blue belts out there, but they are much more competitive. And when I say competitive, here's what I mean. White belts typically have anywhere from 2 months to 3, maybe 4 years of training if they're not consistent, but on average, 3 years of consistent-ish training is where white belts cut off. That's usually when people start getting their blue belt. And if they're not very competitive, then it doesn't matter if they've been training for 6 years. If they've taken a bunch of time off and they're not consistent, what matters is mat time, mat hours. When you finally get to that blue belt, you enter into a much more serious competitive pool. Not quite as competitive as the expert divisions. That's not what this video is about. White belt tournaments, oftentimes, I say don't matter. Honestly, almost no tournament in jiu-jitsu matters that much. At the end of the day, it's what you get out of it. It's the experience. But when you go from white belt tournaments where most matches, yes, they can be decided on points, but if you get a submission, people will tap because it hurts. So chokes, for example, you can get it across the neck, and if it hurts, people will tap. Once you start getting into those blue belt competitions, especially the finals rounds, doesn't matter if it hurts. What matters is whether or not someone's gonna fall asleep or if it's going to break. So you really have to step up your submission game. And this was a very big learning curve for me as an individual. Going from letting go of submissions when people quit because it's a little bit uncomfortable because you're supposed to, because it's a choke and it's uncomfortable, versus letting go because you're going to fall asleep. And when you get in those blue belt divisions, you get a lot more people who need to be put to sleep. Not that you have to sleep them, not that you have to choke them unconscious, but you have to have that threat for them to tap. And if it's not a real threat of them falling asleep, they're not going to tap. You know, they're going to slip out of it, they're going to hold their breath, they're going to do what they have to do to defend and move on, so that way they can win the division. At white belt, it's a lot less competitive in that regard. And at blue belt, you're going to get a lot more wrestlers. Most of the time, if they're a wrestler, yes, they might enter the white belt competitions. I even have a video about that. But generally, people who have been wrestling, especially if they've come through all of high school and started in college, their coaches are going to put them in the blue belt divisions, especially in the no-gi divisions. In the gi divisions, it might be a little bit different because you have to compete at your white belt rank, but in no-gi, you can compete in what's called an intermediate division. Sometimes that's blue and purple, sometimes it's 3 to 5 years of grappling. It depends on the tournament organizer, it depends on the specific rule set, but you're going to run into people who are wrestlers. And what you're also going to run into at the blue belt division is specialists. When you're a white belt, you won't really get people who have a specialty in a guard, let's say lapel guard, for example, or spider guard. When you're in those blue belt divisions, you'll run into people who have a purple belt level game in a specific area of jiu-jitsu. If they're a wrestler, their game might be takedowns and topside control and pinning pressure. If they're a jiu-jitsu blue belt who focused on guard, their purple belt-ish level game might be close guard, might be spider guard, might be collar sleeve guard. And with that position, if they can get there, they're going to be much more likely to submit you because they've spent more time in that position. If you train as a white belt and compete as a white belt, generally everybody's almost on the same playing field. Sometimes you'll have sandbaggers, but usually they don't stick around for very long because it's a white belt tournament, right? You want to progress through the belts, and generally once you start winning 1 or 2 tournaments, your coach is going to be looking to promote you. It's not the same for everybody, but in general, you don't want to be sandbagging and winning every white belt tournament forever. You want to conquer the division, get your medals, and then move up to the next division. So when you're that blue belt division and you've maybe won or at least medaled in a white belt tournament before, now you're going to go against these specialist players, these people who have a pretty deep game in a specific area. So if you don't have your own game plan, you're going to get crushed. That's totally normal to go from winning white belt to losing at blue belt. That's sort of how it works in the belt system in jiu-jitsu. Every single time you compete, you're at the bottom of the heap again, and you got to work your way up to winning those medals and being more competitive at that rank. So these specialists in the blue belt divisions are going to have a deeper game, and what they're going to be trying to do, and what you should be trying to do, is develop that specialized game where you're really good at one specific thing. Maybe it's a type of submission, maybe it's an armbar, maybe it's a triangle, maybe it's a few specific setups, but you're going to want to funnel people into that game. And people likewise are going to be trying to funnel you into their game. What really is the decider in these blue belt tournaments is who takes the initiative, who starts putting people where they want to put them. For me, when I was a blue belt, I had some decent takedowns, but I wasn't a specialist at that. What I was really a specialist at was triangles and honestly topside mount. So my takedowns were pretty decent, but every once in a while I would pull guard. And if I could get someone and take them down and get into top mount, well, you got 2 points for the takedown. If you pass guard, you get 3. If you just ended inside control, whatever. But I would get the knee on belly points sometimes. Then I would get the mount points. That's 2 plus 2 plus 4, that's 8 to 0. And at that point, it becomes much easier to win the match by submission. Yes, you could camp it out and, just try to win on points. But for me, and especially now, I always want to try to go for a submission. That's part of my personality. That's part of how I came up as a grappler. Once I was up on points, it would be way easier to get submissions because the other person was panicking, because they have to make big moves. Especially if you're 2-3 minutes into a 6-minute match, they start to panic because they know they're down 8-0. So they start pushing and extending their arms, maybe getting an armbar. They start going for things that would leave them exposed. And that was really how it funneled into my game. Now, that's not to say I was a super deep specialist at anything, but I had a core game plan that I was generally pretty good at. And when you enter those blue belt divisions, the submissions are more serious, the competitors are more serious, and they have things that are much more dangerous. Sometimes you get leg lock specialists. That's kind of scary at blue belt, especially those straight ankle locks. Those are much more legal in basically every kind of rule set. So some of those guys grip on those legs and start getting it, and they get quick, easy wins. Maybe not easy, but quicker wins leads to more gas tank later on in the competition, so that way when you get to those final rounds, you're not as tired. And that's one of the reasons why I would continue to hunt submissions, not just because my coaches encouraged it, but also because it would lead to more energy in the gas tank later on. Especially if you're competing gi, no gi, absolute division, it would really start to wear on you after all. That's the main difference between white belt and blue belt tournaments, is the pools are almost the same size. Sometimes you have more at white, sometimes you have more at blue, but really it comes down to the intensity and the seriousness of competitors. Thanks for watching the video. Hope to hear from you in the comments.